Look closely at these scenes. The opulent banquets, the flowing silks, the careful arrangement of objects designed to impress. This is the world we often mistake for civilization itself. We build our lives upon comfort, crafting exquisite cages from velvet and gold. We accumulate not just wealth in coin, but status in favor and meaning in possession. It feels beautiful, does it not? Stable, predictable. A tapestry woven of expensive tastes and soft cushions. But ask yourself something fundamental. When did all this luxury become a weight? Look at the faces gathered here. They are masks of contentment, performing the roles of success and belonging. Each gentle gesture, every polished word, seems to uphold an invisible scaffold that supports their fragile sense of self-worth. They live as if more things mean more happiness, as if the next acquisition or the next accolade will finally fill the cavernous space within them. There is a profound quietude here beneath the gaiety, a stillness that rings with unanswered questions. We are taught to associate comfort with freedom. The padded chair means relaxation. The stocked larder signifies safety. But what if this deep-seated association is a magnificent delusion? What if the things we build around ourselves, the sprawling villas, the complex social rituals, the very need for endless decoration, are not shelters from hardship, but prisons made entirely of desire? Consider the architecture of our longing. We do not merely desire safety, we desire the appearance of safety. We do not simply crave comfort, we crave the social endorsement that tells us this level of ease is what a good life should feel like. This pursuit constructs a gilded cage, where every bars are seemingly made of joy and every corner is scented with expensive perfume. And inside this beautiful trap, freedom cannot breathe. The spirit requires air, unfiltered by expectations or cushions. The mind yearns for friction, the kind that sharpens understanding rather than dulling it with silk pillows and predictable routine. We have forgotten how to be simply present. We are always planning the next luxury, perfecting the next meal, curating the perfect image for consumption. This constant performance is exhausting, far more draining than any genuine struggle. There was a belief once that wisdom resided only in high towers and polished forums. That deep truth needed expensive libraries and eloquent speeches to exist. But what if truth prefers the open ground? What if it finds its purest form not amidst these carefully staged displays of affluence, but where necessity rules? The Cynics dared to whisper against this prevailing hum of materialism. They looked at the polished spectacle of our lives, the endless procession from banquet hall to drawing room, and saw only frantic energy masking deep spiritual poverty. They rejected the velvet comfort because they suspected it was not padding for weary bones, but rather muffling ear-wax trapping genuine thought. This suspicion became a deeply uncomfortable seed planted in the fertile ground of self-doubt. How long can we sustain this edifice of luxury if the foundation is merely a mountain of borrowed validation? We have become so proficient at maintaining these delicate social structures that we fear disrupting even one small piece of furniture, lest the whole elaborate illusion collapse. The truth demands us to strip away the superfluity. It demands simplicity, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a philosophical necessity for genuine being. To find out who we are when all our props, our titles, our clothing, our bank accounts, are removed. To see if the core of our identity can survive on nothing more than breath and clear understanding. This realization is terrifying to those who have invested their entire self-worth into the material world. It suggests that the hardest path is often the simplest one, walking barefoot, carrying only what is absolutely essential, and speaking only what is truly necessary. The silk robes felt heavy, weighted not by fabric, but by expectation. For so long, we mistake the weight of comfort for the assurance of life. We build our lives with grand structures, impressive houses, careful routines, and carefully curated conversations designed to showcase status. Yet, beneath this opulent veneer, a subtle tension begins to gather, like dust collecting on forgotten statues. A deep-seated itch suggests that all these polished artifacts are merely temporary distractions from the core question of existence itself. This quiet doubt starts small. It whispers in moments when we pass glossy advertisements for unattainable perfection, or during dinners where every polite exchange seems engineered purely to affirm someone's social standing. The mind begins to reject the narrative that more is better. It becomes an uncomfortable suspicion. What if our entire understanding of success is built upon a beautiful illusion? What if the relentless pursuit of things only leads us further away from ourselves? This initial discomfort, this whisper of doubt, is often dismissed. We hear polite laughter, gentle suggestions to simply enjoy the moment, or dismissive comments that suggest we are merely prone to melancholy musings. The prevailing atmosphere insists on continuity and acceptance of the established order. To question the system feels inherently radical, a transgression against the accepted harmony of civilization. The true cost of this comfort, however, is not monetary. It is existential. It demands a sacrifice of intellectual honesty. To maintain the comfortable facade, one must constantly smooth over the rough edges of inquiry, lest the elegant dam of convention break open entirely. The soul finds itself caught between the safety net of tradition and the vast, terrifying expanse of an unknown truth. The whispers grow louder. They point not to specific failures, a lost coin or a poor investment, but to deep structural flaws in our values. They question why we value gilded chairs over clean air, or elaborate titles over simple, unburdened breath. They challenge the inherent belief that external possessions can fill an internal void. To entertain this doubt means accepting vulnerability. It means entering intellectual spaces where one must defend not merely a viewpoint, but an entire way of life. One feels exposed, as if standing naked in the bright midday sun, with every flaw and unfulfilled desire visible to all who pass by. The social instinct is immediate. Recoil, reaffirm, distract. We are conditioned to seek comfort in shared belief, and doubt threatens that collective sanctuary. The journey inward requires a shedding of external validation. It forces us to sit with the uncomfortable feeling of being fundamentally misunderstood, yet simultaneously liberated by that very misunderstanding. This questioning is not intended to wound. It is merely an act of intellectual archaeology, digging through layers of cultural assumption until the bedrock truth can be reached. The whispers often feel rebellious, suggesting a return to a raw, pre-structured state of existence, a life stripped bare of unnecessary artifice. They imply that wisdom resides not in libraries filled with accumulated knowledge, but in the simple self-sufficiency mastered by those who have nothing to lose and nothing to prove. This thought is daunting because it requires us to admit that everything we currently rely on for identity might be fundamentally worthless. We start recognizing the pattern of deflection. When challenged on a moral or philosophical level, the response rarely addresses the depth of the concern. Instead, they redirect attention to one's career, one's lineage, one's impeccable taste. The conversation shifts from what is true to how do you look when you talk about it. This redirection acts as a sophisticated form of intellectual gaslighting, designed to make us doubt the very validity of our inquiry. The growing awareness of this superficiality can lead to moments of quiet despair. a sense that the grand edifice of human achievement rests on sand, the consensus opinion, the profitable venture, the aesthetically pleasing lie. Yet, within this despair lies a profound invitation. If everything external is ephemeral, then where do we anchor our sense of self? The most persistent whisper insists that true freedom is not found in having enough, but in needing little. It suggests that status symbols are nothing more than highly polished cages built by consensus fear. The acceptance of this notion, that simplicity is the highest achievement, is profoundly unsettling to those who have spent lifetimes building their towers of desire. It demands humility and a radical shift in perspective. This uncomfortable whisper becomes the internal compass, pulling us away from the warm glow of societal approval toward the cold, clear light of genuine self-assessment. We had been trapped in the soft velvet of assumption. We lived in a world built of polished marble and expensive promises. Our comforts were not merely possessions. They were subtle architects, constructing invisible walls around the true self. In the opulence of our gatherings, we spent our days performing roles, carefully curating an image of success that felt both hollow and deeply necessary. The weight of these expectations, the glittering necessity of maintaining appearances, was far heavier than any physical burden. The whispers of doubt started quietly enough. At first, they were mere intellectual disagreements, polite deviations from the accepted script. We questioned why such immense labor was spent simply accumulating more things, or how status could be measured by the depth of one's bank account. These doubts felt dangerous, like poorly tuned strings about to snap a perfect chord. Our peers met them with indulgent laughter, a sound that signaled dismissal and compliance. It became clear quickly that civilization, in its current state, was an overwhelming form of self-delusion. We had exchanged authentic existence for material comfort, and the struggle to wake up was not a matter of sheer willpower. It required the dismantling of entire belief structures. It demanded recognizing that the things we treasured most often served only to keep us from looking inward. The path forward, then, needed an extreme reset, a radical break from the polished halls and soft cushions of expectation. We realized that questioning merely within those walls was insufficient. One had to step outside them entirely. This required a kind of intellectual pilgrimage, a journey away from familiar comforts towards uncomfortable truth. It is against this backdrop that he appeared, not with pomp or fanfare, but with an utter indifference to the environment around him. He was a visual contradiction to everything we understood about refinement and social standing. Clad in rough garments that spoke of no careful stitching or costly dyes, his presence entered our polished orbit like a sudden gust of cold, undeniable reality. He did not seek attention, he merely occupied space. Yet, occupying that space was an act of profound disruption. His very existence challenged the underlying premise of everything we considered valuable. We were accustomed to people who arrived with layers of pedigree and intention. He arrived simply being. This forced us, in a flash of sudden, uncomfortable clarity, to examine our own superficial veneers. He seemed utterly at ease, not because he had money or power, but because he appeared entirely devoid of need for either. His movements were direct, unburdened by the careful considerations of status. He navigated the intricate rituals of our privileged lives with the casualness of someone crossing a patch of dry dirt, yet every passing gesture landed like a philosophical hammer against the ornate glass of our complacency. The shift was immediate and jarring. The smooth flow of our conversation faltered, disrupted by an abrasive simplicity. We were used to arguments involving philosophy or finance. We were not equipped for a challenge delivered by sheer, unadulterated presence. His appearance alone was a commentary, a silent accusation that perhaps all the careful construction around us was unnecessary scaffolding. We found ourselves watching him, analyzing him like an ethnographic specimen, searching for the key to understanding his apparent lack of concern. Was he eccentric? Was he merely poor? We defaulted to these quick judgments, because acknowledging his deeper philosophical challenge would have been too destabilizing a realization. To accept his worldview was to admit that our carefully constructed reality might be entirely arbitrary. The air thickened with unspoken tension. The subtle artifice we usually employed, the witty remark, the polite redirection of focus, failed us. We were confronted by an openness that demanded nothing from us and accepted everything. It was a terrifying form of freedom, suggesting that happiness required not careful acquisition, but radical subtraction. This simple entrance served as the ultimate preamble to questioning the very definitions of life. He opened the door not with words or arguments, but with the quiet insistence of his own unadorned existence, signaling that the only true road was the open one, the path away from the predictable, comfortable enclosure we had built for ourselves. The air in the atrium felt thick with unspoken rules. Every piece of furniture spoke of deep money and inherited taste. Every laugh was calibrated to match the perceived success of its participants. We had entered this circle believing that knowledge alone would be enough armor, but it proved insufficient against the sheer weight of societal pretense. The conversation had become a delicate performance, a recitation of titles, accomplishments, and carefully curated grievances meant only to reinforce one's elevated position. Yet beneath the veneer of polite discourse, a deeper dissonance was growing within me. I felt an overwhelming urge to puncture the balloon of their collective comfort with something truly disruptive. That simple truth that they were all living in elaborate costumes, performing for an invisible audience. I watched the way hands moved across crystal and linen, measuring status not by what was owned, but by how gracefully it could be displayed. The conversation drifted toward trade negotiations, discussing markets and fluctuating currencies, all of which seemed impossibly distant from the basic necessity of a good life. They spoke of abundance as if it were an intrinsic virtue, forgetting that true virtue resides in sufficiency. If this endless accumulation was indeed the measure of human worth, then I must ask, at what point does excess become not merely luxurious, but deeply burdensome? A single thought began to crystallize, sharp and undeniably crude, forcing itself past the polite barriers of my own introspection. It related to something so fundamental, so stripped bare of cultural refinement, that voicing it felt like sacrilege in this hallowed space of privilege. I realized that the true crime here was not ignorance. It was a willful, sustained forgetting what the human spirit requires when all external supports are removed. The Cynics taught us to strip away everything unnecessary, the art, the tailored robes, the generational expectation, to live only by nature, untouched by custom. I wanted to speak that plain, raw truth into the polished silence of this dinner party, something that would force them out of their comfortable reverie and back onto the hard ground of reality. I waited for a suitable moment, a lull in the superficial banter about foreign policy or investments in Eastern grain mills. When it arrived, I didn't make a grand gesture. I simply spoke, my voice carrying an unexpected weight that cut through the polite murmur like flint striking steel. The question was not complex. It required no academic background and possessed zero political subtlety. What is the actual purpose of all this? The phrase hung in the air, utterly plain, devastatingly direct. It seemed too simple to be intended as a question at all. more like an accusation wrapped in mild philosophical inquiry. The ensuing silence was immediate, thick with shock and sudden defensiveness. Eyes that had been lazily scanning my face for signs of polite participation now narrowed, searching for the trick, the flaw in the simplicity. The wealthy found themselves suddenly exposed not by me, but by the question itself. They were forced to articulate a purpose, a justifying narrative for their vast resources and restrictive lives. Was it lineage? Security? The maintenance of an image that was more important than actual happiness? A patron smiled, attempting to regain control by suggesting I merely needed to educate myself on economics. A nobleman chuckled dismissively, implying I lacked the requisite education to understand complex societal structures. Their laughter sounded brittle, like glass about to shatter under the slightest pressure of genuine thought. But I did not flinch at their ridicule. I held the stare, letting the simplicity of my query do the work for me. Because in that simple phrase lay a colossal philosophical weight. If you remove every external pillar of perceived importance, the fine meal, the expensive clothing, the comforting routine, what remains? And if what remains is simply the self, stripped bare and vulnerable to nature and desire, are you truly living, or merely rehearsing for a comfortable decline? The uncomfortable truth was that they had meticulously built a fortress around their desires. They were not building wealth. They were building elaborate shields against questioning. The comfort itself had become the primary antagonist in their lives, and my question acted like a tiny, perfectly aimed slingshot pellet at the heart of that massive illusion. They struggled to answer because an answer would require admitting profound vulnerability, admitting that all the intricate rules, customs, and acquisitions they cherished were ultimately nothing more than decorative scaffolding over a simple human desire for belonging. To admit such things was not merely rude. It felt genuinely dangerous to their established identity. The deeper realization struck me then. Genuine wisdom does not announce itself in elegant discourse or volumes of theory. It arrives like the jarring, unsophisticated clarity of a question that cannot be answered with money or status. It requires nothing but observation and the courage to speak what everyone else is pretending not to notice. Their defensive bluster was their greatest failure, because when stripped of the performance, all they were left with was brittle self-interest, poorly masked by fine silks and good wine. The journey toward truth could not be achieved through refinement. It demanded a radical rejection of every exquisite comfort, right down to the silence used to hide those uncomfortable questions. The Cynic's challenge had rattled the foundations of polished comfort. The initial intellectual discomfort, stemming from polite questioning and gnawing doubt, was nothing compared to the raw confrontation that followed. We had learned that merely observing luxury was insufficient. One must actively seek out the unfiltered truth beneath the gilded veneer. The next step required not just observation, but immersion, a voluntary stripping away of pretense. The lesson found in the polished halls of power and excessive wealth needed a different lens. The mundane, honest labor of daily life. The protagonist began to wander away from the opulent circles, drawn instead by the quiet necessity of human activity. They lingered near kitchens bustling with servants washing dishes, observing men and women engaged in manual toil. These scenes were paradoxically purifying. In the back rooms, amidst the clatter of bowls and the scent of soap and exhaustion, the masks that adorned high society dissolved completely. Here, pretension was impossible. There was only sweat and necessity. The protagonist watched a chef meticulously chopping vegetables, his movements efficient and deeply focused, revealing a deep humanity untouched by inherited title or endless leisure. They observed a street vendor arranging imperfect fruits, each piece telling a story of its own survival. The contrast was stark. The elaborate charade of dinner parties, where conversations circled endlessly around status and lineage, versus the raw economy of movement required to clean, build, or sell something with one's hands. In this labor, the true texture of life emerged. The protagonist began to see that status did not come from birthright, but merely served as a social agreement, a complex costume meant to hide fundamental vulnerability. The mirror reflected more than just the actions of others. It held up reflections of the self. When they saw someone perform difficult labor with stoic grace, they suddenly questioned their own comfortable inaction. They realized that perhaps their privileged life had fostered not wisdom, but a profound atrophy, a gentle, luxurious inability to handle genuine difficulty or genuine honesty. The necessity of humility became painfully clear in this environment. Humility was not merely feeling small. It was adopting the posture of someone who acknowledges nothing they know for granted. It required stepping into the shoes of labor and recognizing that human value resides not in what one owns, but in what one contributes, however simple or messy that contribution may be. This shift in perspective was a subtle rebellion. It was an internal turning away from the perceived grand narratives of success and towards the humble grammar of survival. The protagonist started paying attention to the details, the slight ache in the back of a laborer, the satisfaction in a clean slate, the simple geometry of necessity. These were the unwritten laws of life, far more reliable than any social contract signed with costly ink. The weight of this self-discovery was immense. To look upon the world through this lens meant accepting that superficiality was not just wrong, but actively detrimental to the soul. It demanded a surrender, a voluntary descent from the pedestal of expectation to the level ground of basic human existence. This realization was profoundly uncomfortable, suggesting that true knowledge was always found at the periphery, in the spaces society deemed unworthy of attention. The protagonist understood then that comfort was often simply inertia, a pleasant resistance to change or hardship. The pursuit of meaning could not be outsourced to luxury goods or elaborate social rituals. It had to be forged through friction, through the necessary grit of lived experience. They began to approach these simple scenes, the wash basins, the market stalls, with an almost sacred reverence, recognizing them as classrooms where the greatest philosophies were taught by necessity itself. The mirror showed that true freedom was indistinguishable from this stripped-down state. It was found in the person who could find purpose in scrubbing pots until their knuckles ached, or in the farmer whose livelihood depended solely on the predictable rhythm of the sun and the soil. This humble recognition became the bedrock for every subsequent challenge, preparing the protagonist to face lives built upon fewer illusions. The struggle for truth, we had learned, required a shedding of comforts. It meant leaving behind the velvet cage of expectation and the soft beddings of security. Our understanding of freedom was nothing more than an intellectual concept until we were forced to experience its cost in physical exhaustion and genuine vulnerability. We moved towards places that demanded everything, places where the artificial structures of wealth and status held no sway, only the raw reality of human need and simple survival. The polished marble floors gave way to rough earth, and the predictable routine of curated comfort dissolved into uncertainty. We found ourselves drawn toward the periphery of civilization, beyond the neatly maintained walls of the elite quarter. The challenge became one of daily discipline. It was not enough merely to question the luxury of others. We had to prove our capacity for resilience in a life stripped down to its most essential components. To understand what truly sustained us, we began living by necessity. Sleep no longer came in deep, guarded chambers, but under the open sky. The first nights were brutal lessons. The familiar cocoon of blankets and warm rooms proved nothing more than a comforting illusion. Lying exposed on the uneven ground, acutely aware of every passing creature, every sudden shift in wind, our ingrained human habit was to recoil from discomfort. Fear became the primary teacher. We learned that true rest was not found in softness, but in an acceptance of what was unavoidable. The cold seeped up through the thin sleeping mats, and the erratic rhythm of nocturnal sounds pulled us taut with alertness. The body, accustomed to gentle environments, protested violently. Muscles atrophied from lack of use, and every minor chill felt like a profound assault on our system. Yet, each night taught a deeper philosophical lesson than any lecture could provide. That fear itself is the greatest luxury we build for ourselves. We were teaching our minds to decouple safety from comfort. The great palace walls, magnificent as they seemed from afar, represented nothing more than an artificial boundary against natural reality. By crossing over that threshold, we weren't just changing geography. We were engaging in a deliberate philosophical rejection of conditioned security. We chose the unpredictable, exposed life over the predictable, controlled one. This choice was not made lightly. It required abandoning the perceived guarantees of civilization, which are often nothing more than elaborate social agreements designed to maintain peace, a peace that is frequently itself an illusion. This exposure forced a radical confrontation with self-sufficiency. We realized how dependent we truly were on external systems, the clean water that must be piped in, the predictable supply of food, the shelter from rain. When those resources became merely available, not guaranteed, our focus shifted entirely to internal reserves. What sustains us when the foundations are removed? It was resilience, the quiet endurance of the spirit. The discipline extended beyond mere sleep. Meals became lessons in humility. We were taught to value sustenance in its simplest form: bread, water, perhaps a handful of wild foraged berries. The initial complaints were audible, the lamentations over missing spices, or the disappointment at the lack of a roasted meal. These small grievances proved how deeply ingrained our attachment to sophisticated comfort truly was. Yet, by enduring that stark simplicity day after day, a remarkable shift occurred. Complaining became exhausting. Gratitude for basic existence became instinctual. We began to perceive the richness in utter scarcity. This stripping away of luxury served to refine our senses and sharpen our focus on what genuinely matters. The grand preoccupations of status, the expensive garments, the complex social maneuvering, the accumulation of goods, all appeared suddenly trivial against the backdrop of a rising dawn or a biting night chill. They were merely distractions from the difficult work of simply being present. This was the mirror that cynicism offered, forcing us to see ourselves without the elaborate filters of society. We saw our own readiness to complain, our ingrained expectation of ease. The true genius of this harsh environment was that it demanded a kind of radical purity. To survive, one had to be alert, efficient, and utterly present in every moment. There was no room for pretense, no time for feigned concern or intellectual posturing. When we were forced into the rhythms dictated by the sun and the seasons, our self-perception underwent a fundamental restructuring. Our worth was redefined away from what we possessed, toward what we could endure and contribute. We found that true power resided not in the corner office or the tailored cloak, but in the quiet strength of adapting to instability. The lesson woven into the fabric of nights, spent outside the protection of walls, is profound. That many of the things society designates as necessary for a good life are merely elaborate psychological comforts, traps that keep us complacent and unexamined. Comfort makes one predictable. Freedom demands an element of calculated discomfort, forcing us to confront the elemental nature of our own will. We learned that robustness is not something bought or acquired through status, but something forged through voluntary hardship. Only by choosing the uncomfortable path could we prove that our philosophy was not merely a fashionable theory, but a deep-seated, functional way of living. This experience set the stage for everything that followed, an unwavering commitment to simplicity and an indifference to the fickle judgment of those who had never chosen the harder, more truthful road. After the chill nights and the constant watchfulness of the outer world came a strange quiet. It was not the empty silence of abandonment, but the deep hush that settles when one finally ceases to strive against the current. We had stripped away layers both physical and philosophical. The woven comfort of civilization was gone, replaced by rough-spun realities. The feel of cool earth beneath bare feet, the ache in muscles unused to labor, and the constant negotiation with elemental necessity. Our understanding of worth, once tied up in gilded status or endless possessions, now hung suspended over a quiet campfire. We found ourselves observing one another, not through the lens of societal expectation, but under the unblinking light of truth. Reflection became both a comfort and a challenge. The lesson was deceptively small. It arrived with nothing more than a meager spread upon a rough mat, dry bread, perhaps boiled roots, and water drawn from a clear, unforgiving stream. This meal demanded an acute stillness. There was no elaborate preparation, no ceremonial arrangement of food that spoke of abundance or cultivated taste. Yet, within the silence surrounding this simple nourishment lay a profound philosophical weight. We ate slowly, intentionally. Every crumb, every sip, became an act of defiance against the ingrained habit of entitlement. It was a meal designed not merely to sustain the body, but to steady the mind. Watching others react to this simplicity was perhaps the hardest lesson of all. Some men, those who had grown accustomed to the soft cushions and the constant supply from polished kitchens, showed subtle signs of restlessness. Their complaints were quiet at first, veiled under a veneer of polite discomfort. They spoke not of hunger, but of lack in the way that implies a profound disruption to routine. They complained about the texture of the bread, or the modest quality of the water, or the early hour of the meal. These murmurs seemed insignificant on their own, mere petty complaints against scarcity. Yet, when viewed through the sharp, clear lens of self-sufficiency gained outside the city walls, these complaints were utterly meaningless. The small size of the portion became a profound measuring stick for true value. It eliminated the luxury of desire. If you are constantly anticipating more wine, softer linens, sweeter fare, you are always in debt to something external. Your satisfaction is contingent upon fortune, on the whims of others, or on the seasonal bounty delivered by the merchants. But when necessity governs the meal, when sustenance must be extracted directly from what is available and simply shared, desire shrinks to its honest size. It reveals itself for what it truly is, a master, constantly demanding tribute. I realized then that complaint was not an indicator of true hardship, but merely an echo of habit. Those accustomed to comfort did not lament the lack of food. They lamented the disruption of their expectation of food. They were enslaved by an imagined abundance, and this realization shifted everything. The physical deprivation of the meal taught a profound lesson about mental freedom. The biggest lesson was this: genuine self-sufficiency is not just about gathering enough food to live on. It is about achieving the emotional detachment from needing anything more than that basic sustenance, and more importantly, from needing external approval or even expectation altogether. If one's mind can be satisfied by bread and water, then no feast, no matter how opulent, no matter how celebrated, can genuinely nourish the soul. Such feasts only provide a temporary distraction for an empty spirit. This understanding forced me to look back upon my past life with eyes that now possessed crystalline clarity. I had once considered intellectual sharpness or social acumen as my most valuable assets. These skills, honed in polite salons and academic debates, turned out to be rather fragile things. They were sophisticated mechanisms of evasion. They allowed one to appear knowledgeable while remaining fundamentally untested by the simple reality of existence. The Cynics, by living so purely within necessity, taught me that true mastery is found not through accumulation of knowledge, but through radical acceptance of what is. We started to understand that civilization was nothing more than a sophisticated form of mutual distraction. We build walls of comfort, perform rituals of status, and consume goods in an endless cycle of acquisition, all to avoid the single, unignorable truth that the self, stripped bare, is capable of immense peace. It meant accepting the lack of cushion, the sting of cold air, or the gritness of raw food. It meant choosing resilience over comfort. It meant realizing that when we can be content with the bare minimum, a meal of bread and water, we are not impoverished, we are gloriously free. This freedom is untradeable, unstealable, and wholly internal. The path forward was no longer a struggle against society's norms, but an inward journey toward absolute contentment. We learned that the greatest luxury is indifference to opinion. It is the quiet power of saying, "This meager bread is enough. This rough sleep will do." And in that simple declaration of sufficiency, a revolutionary kind of power emerged, transforming me from merely a questioning observer into someone capable of sustained peace. The hard-won stillness found outside the walls had given a certain composure to the spirit. The petty judgments and the glittering expectations of city life, once overwhelming, now seemed distant echoes, mere noise from a far shore. Yet, even after stripping away the necessities of comfort and survival, the old instincts of social judgment remained potent, coiled tightly within the heart. Returning to the orbit of structured society was not a joyous return. It felt like slipping back into oiled silk that slowly stifles breath. The most difficult confrontations were not with physical elements, but with the deeply embedded beliefs of others. To be truly free meant accepting an uncomfortable vulnerability, one that demanded challenging the established social contract. A contract built entirely upon mutual performance and unspoken agreement. It was a subtle art, knowing when to push back against perceived injustice without creating unnecessary conflict, or worse, making oneself seem foolish in the pursuit of truth. The world expects you to conform. It applauds competence, wealth, and predictable behavior. To live authentically, having found that authenticity in hardship, meant becoming philosophically unpredictable. It demanded a kind of internal quietude, a resilience that acted as its own formidable armor against external criticism. This was perhaps the most grueling lesson, learning not just how to survive deprivation, but how to exist while being judged for one's indifference to it. The subtle snickers, the lowered voices speaking over shoulders, the thinly veiled pity in polished gazes, these were the new forms of poverty encountered on the return journey. People were not concerned with virtue. They were concerned with maintaining their own curated image of superiority. They watched the simple life for the unburdened spirit, measuring it against the perceived degradation of utter lack of care. The central conflict became one of profound patience. How does one hold a radical truth? That genuine peace requires nothing more than self-possession and ethical living, in an environment that screams continuously with artificial demands. It is tempting to argue, to explain the philosophy gained on the roadside or during the meager meal. But explanation is itself another form of performance, requiring validation from the listener. And therefore, the deepest wisdom was often found in silence, in a quiet, steadfast bearing that refused to acknowledge the parameters of critique. To let the accusations pass through without changing the inner posture, that required more discipline than any physical ordeal. The expectation placed upon the cynic archetype, or anyone who rejects luxury for truth, is immense. They must be constantly ready to defend their refusal, yet speaking makes them visible again, vulnerable once more to the very system they reject. The self had to learn a profound indifference to opinion. Not apathy, but a reasoned detachment, the realization that one's inner state remains unperturbed regardless of external judgment is not merely an intellectual concept. It is a muscular habit, requiring daily practice against the soft slings and arrows of social pressure. It becomes an internal negotiation, accepting the necessary discomfort of misunderstanding as the ultimate tax paid for freedom. I observed how these powerful figures, the senators, the merchants, the connoisseurs of fine things, relied on shared assumptions to maintain their identity. If one disrupts those assumptions, not only is the disruption visible, but the foundations supporting the entire edifice seem to wobble slightly. They crave agreement. They fear deviation more than any physical danger. And in that pattern of craving and fear, I saw a predictable weakness. The confrontation was less a sharp debate and more a slow revealing of their own internal anxieties. Sometimes, the most powerful response is simply non-engagement. To look into the critical gaze, not with offense or defensiveness, but with an absolute neutrality, as if observing a passing cloud, a natural phenomenon entirely divorced from personal meaning. This indifference becomes a quiet, potent rebellion, signaling that the critic holds no sway over one's internal peace. The greatest skill is recognizing the difference between helpful critique and the empty sound of ego being threatened. When another person mocks simplicity or questions the integrity of an uncomfortable truth, it rarely stems from genuine concern for well-being. It usually springs from a need to confirm their own elaborate status within the social hierarchy. They are not attacking me. They are defending the fragility of their comfort itself. The heart had to learn this subtle separation, acknowledging their fear while remaining unmoved by its articulation. This is the mature state of philosophy, where the inner citadel cannot be breached, no matter how loud the siege outside. The expectation I faced was that I would either renounce my newfound simplicity for the sake of acceptance, or that I would react emotionally to prove my point. In both cases, the system wins by dictating my internal resources. The only truly free response is one predicated solely on principle, maintaining the chosen path regardless of personal cost or public ridicule. It was a profound shift from mere self-sufficiency, which deals with hunger and shelter, to emotional and philosophical self-sufficiency, which addresses status, approval, and societal definition. To stand before those who believed in their own elaborate systems, to be questioned, to be dismissed, yet to respond only with the quiet dignity of principle, was an act far more radical than any physical rejection of civilization. It redefined power itself. True strength is not the ability to accumulate or command. It is the unshakable commitment to one's highest ethical understanding, even when all empirical evidence suggests otherwise. This confrontation solidified that external structures, no matter how grand or comfortable they appear, are utterly irrelevant to the architecture of a virtuous life. The worth remains, defined only by its alignment with reason and nature, entirely untouched by the whims of the crowd. The journey back to the center of oneself is often marked not by triumphant fanfare, but by a quiet withdrawal. After weeks spent dismantling the comfortable structures of expectation, rejecting cushioned beds, dismissing shared meals built on pretense, and enduring judgment in public, a new and profound silence had settled over the soul. This silence was not merely an absence of noise. It was the sound of recognition, the vast, quiet space where truth finally has room to breathe. The characters who had once surrounded him, those deeply invested in the performance of status or the maintenance of societal reputation, found their presence increasingly irrelevant. Their gestures, once powerful signifiers, the concerned nod, the pitying gaze, the carefully worded warning, now struck an odd chord against the hard-won indifference within. He began to walk through the city streets not as a seeker demanding answers, but simply as a person whose path had been redirected by fundamental necessity. The realization was stark and unsettling. Their perceived value in his life, or even society's estimation of him, depended entirely on external affirmation. And he could no longer provide that validation, nor did he crave it. It was this detachment, this voluntary state of being unneeded, that became the deepest, most revolutionary form of freedom. This meant nothingness in their eyes, yet everything to his spirit. He found himself at a grand gathering, an event filled with all the polished trappings of civilization, silk garments rustling like whispered promises, laughter pitched high and brittle, hands gesturing over cups of expensive wine. Yet none of it could touch the calm center he now inhabited. They expected engagement, they anticipated debate, complaint, or perhaps even dramatic despair. Instead, he remained quietly apart, observing the elaborate dance of human self-congratulation. He watched men negotiating abstract concepts while failing to notice the simple weariness in their eyes, women meticulously arranging surfaces that would only be disrupted by life itself. Their conversations revolved around titles and transactions, a circular logic that had long since ceased to hold meaning for him. The paradox of his current state was this: to achieve profound internal wealth, he had to voluntarily inhabit a material poverty that the polite society found deeply disturbing, even insulting. To them, his quietude signaled either madness or extreme lack of concern. But for him, it was perfect self-possession. He saw their efforts, the elaborate clothing, the constant maintenance of appearance, the need to be seen laughing and connected, not as triumphs of culture, but as exquisite forms of collective distraction. The pursuit of being liked, of being recognized, was revealed to be the greatest emotional burden. It tethered them to every slight, every shifting opinion, preventing any true moment of peace or spontaneous action. To shed that need for affirmation required a philosophical leap into a terrifying autonomy. He understood then that the deepest comfort is not found in abundance, but in radical independence. The realization that his worth was non-negotiable, that it did not require their applause, their belief, or their financial support, was intoxicating. It was liberation realized through seeming indifference. When one walks away from a meticulously planned social event without a single word of explanation, The silence left behind is deafening, forcing everyone present to confront the uncomfortable question. What do you truly mean by your time? They had been expecting him to be part of their performance, yet his absence, his simple, quiet non-participation, had forced them to notice the gaps in their own lives, the places where their attention and resources were spent merely for show. This withdrawal became a lesson in self-respect, divorced from consequence. It taught him that the greatest acts of defiance are sometimes the ones performed with utter lack of urgency, simply by choosing not to participate at all. He walked away, not dramatically, but like smoke dissipating into a neutral breeze, leaving behind not anger or bitterness, but a state of quiet certainty. This was the true pinnacle of Cynic wisdom, realizing that humanity does not need you, and therefore, you do not need humanity. That realization is not a moment of despair. It is an explosive emergence of self-reliance. It allows one to navigate the crowded marketplace of human expectation with the cool clarity of a river stone, unmoved by passing currents, indifferent to the superficial shine of gold, yet retaining its elemental strength. He learned that the hardest battles are won when they are fought entirely within the boundaries of one's own mind, requiring only consistency and quiet resolve. The freedom gained from being unneeded is the final proof that true sustenance comes solely from an unbroken connection with principle, not with privilege. It was a silence far richer than any banquet, infinitely more sustaining than any luxury. This profound self-sufficiency meant he no longer needed to explain himself or justify his existence to those whose criteria for worth were so flimsy and arbitrary. He simply moved forward, unencumbered by the weight of expectation, finally enjoying the quiet joy of belonging entirely only to himself. The journey back into the clamor of man was proving more difficult than any wilderness retreat. After rejecting the polished cages and embracing the stark clarity of necessity, I had found a peace that mocked the grand tapestries of the upper city. But the world does not simply reshape itself to accommodate a soul that has learned radical simplicity. It pulls one back, inevitably, into the gravitational pull of expectation, status, and shiny things. I walked through the marketplaces, observing the parade of ambition. Every glance was filtered through the lens of what I had learned. Everything held an artificial price tag, not just in coin, but in emotional investment. The laughter of the merchants sounded hollow. Their pleas seemed mere desperate rituals designed to mask a profound emptiness. I began to feel the tension between this hard-won self-possession and the gentle but relentless pressure of the civilized world. It was during one such afternoon that my path intersected with an unexpected presence. He sat near the edge of the sprawling gathering, not in a corner meant for the poor, nor on the paved thoroughfare reserved for passers-by, but simply occupying space without apology. This man was unremarkable by design, clothing worn thin, bearing the patina of many seasons and necessary struggles. Yet there was a stillness about him that defied the restless energy of the crowds surrounding us. He looked up as I approached, his gaze not one of curiosity or pity, but of simple acknowledgement. It was the look one gives to another soul who has been traveling a similar, arduous path toward some unnameable truth. I recognized in him the spirit of detachment that had become my strange companion. Most people see poverty and judge. They categorize it as failure, deficiency, or charity. They do not see wisdom. Their eyes scanned his ragged state, calculating its perceived value in social currency. But I saw something else, an armor forged entirely of freedom. Because he owned nothing, he coveted nothing. This was a profound lesson painted on the canvas of his quiet existence. We began to converse, though it was less a conversation and more a gentle unfurling of shared silence. He spoke little, often responding with simple metaphors or questions that pierced through layers of assumption. He did not lecture, he simply observed, drawing attention to the fundamental assumptions we all carry like invisible weights. I found myself questioning him about the very foundations of my recent philosophical awakening, the realization that true worth lay outside accumulation and external validation. I spoke of rejecting comfort, of finding meaning in manual labor, and of retreating from the gilded cages of expectation. I expected a nod of profound agreement, perhaps even admiration for my intellectual struggle. Instead, his expression remained neutral, deep, and patient. The unexpected wisdom he offered was not derived from reading texts or mastering rhetoric. It sprang purely from the lived reality of lacking anything but his own steady breath and keen observation. He spoke about expectation itself, suggesting that our deepest forms of bondage are not chains of iron, but merely invisible threads woven by others' hopes for us. He described how we spend our lives building elaborate scaffolding around a single, fragile self-worth, a worth based on titles, possessions, or the praise of strangers. And then he pointed out that every piece of scaffolding requires a builder, and therefore, it requires effort. The moment we decide to stop building those artificial supports, even if the structure falls into ruin, we find ourselves standing alone, but finally free. His insights were delivered with the effortless weightlessness of truth itself. They required no elaborate defense, no footnotes of historical context, just simple observations stripped bare of judgment or sentimentality. It was a clarity that felt almost painful in its absolute directness. I realized that while my struggle had been highly conceptual, a battle waged with ideas and philosophical treatises, his wisdom was embodied. It was practical physics applied to the human condition. I thought about the grand doctrines, the sweeping pronouncements of the academics back in the city. How much of that profound thought was simply a sophisticated intellectual way of avoiding the uncomfortable simplicity faced by men like him? They had mastered the language of detachment without having to live it. The academic understanding remained tethered to comfort. His being outside of comfort gave his words their true, unadulterated power. This encounter became a pivotal turning point. It clarified that wisdom was not a commodity found within libraries or whispered in exclusive circles. It was the byproduct of minimizing need. Poverty, when approached without despair but with sheer observation, is the most rigorous and honest teacher available to humanity. The man did not judge my journey. He simply highlighted the gap between theory and existence. I left him that day with a startling sense of profound gratitude mixed with a potent wave of humble awareness. The philosophical questions I had carried within me, the what-ifs about freedom, simplicity, and worth, suddenly seemed less like urgent intellectual crises and more like natural states awaiting acceptance. My quest was shifting from the act of finding truth to the simple act of becoming aligned with it. The unexpected mentor in poverty taught me that the highest state of being is not achieved through dramatic rejection or triumphant return, but through quiet, persistent equilibrium. He demonstrated that when one sheds the expectation of external appreciation, of material comfort, and even the desire to be recognized as wise, there remains only an unshakable core of pure selfhood. And in that simplicity, I finally began to see not just a path forward, but the profound, challenging beauty of simply remaining. The journey away from the gilded cage had revealed a harsh truth. The pursuit of perfection, the desire for immaculate beauty, is often the most elaborate illusion of all. We spend so much energy trying to maintain an ideal picture, a city that must always shine, a life that must always look successful, flawless. This relentless striving toward polished ideals leaves us exhausted, alienated from the messy truth of existence. The philosopher had learned that true wisdom does not reside in marble plazas or manicured gardens. It dwells in the seams and cracks where things are allowed to simply be. The protagonist walked through the unplanned arteries of the city. These were the streets the guides ignore, choked with vendors' stalls, mismatched paint peeling from ancient walls, overflowing refuse bins that speak silently of humanity's discarded needs. It was a landscape far removed from the idealized frescoes presented in history books or art galleries. Here, beauty did not demand symmetry. It celebrated resilience. A knot of vibrant color, a carelessly hanging wash line, brightly patterned against grimy concrete, spoke louder than any commissioned sculpture. The mind wrestled with this unexpected visual chaos. The academic ideals suggested that order equated to worth, that civilization meant eliminating imperfection. But the Cynic's spirit taught something different, that the imperfections were not merely flaws, they were signatures of life itself. Every scuff mark on a cobblestone, every uneven tilt of a rickety awning, told a story far richer than any polished pronouncement could contain. He paused beside a small outdoor workshop. Tools lay scattered haphazardly on a rough wooden bench, evidence of work completed imperfectly, yet effectively. The craftsman was chipping away at stone, sweat shining on his brow, concentrating wholly on the tactile reality before him. There was no pretense here, only utility and persistence. This scene contradicted every notion of curated existence he had been fed throughout his privileged life. The philosophical implications deepened. If perfect beauty requires stripping away everything messy, then what are we actually left with? Only a harsh reduction to core function. The struggle was to embrace the fact that living is inherently messy. It involves dirt and decay alongside moments of startling grace. To find meaning in such an imperfect urban space required relinquishing the desire for aesthetically pleasing narrative. The inner conflict flared, the innate resistance to disorder versus the deep, undeniable peace found within acceptance. The city's flaws were not accidents. They were vital components of its continuous being. They represented a raw, persistent reality that simply refused to be polished into a single, marketable ideal. It was the beauty of entropy, the grace note struck by things falling apart just enough to reveal their true substance. Passing through a crowded market square, a riot of mismatched goods and loud negotiations, he watched children playing amidst the clutter. Their games involved stumbling over discarded crates and navigating around spilled sacks of spices. In that chaotic play, there was an unburdened joy, untainted by status or expectation. It was a wild authenticity that cost nothing to possess, yet worth more than all the wealth displayed in the pristine districts he had left behind. The Cynic taught him to find solace not in escape from difficulty, but in recognition of its inherent value. The grime was not failure, it was patina. The crooked line was not error, it was character. This realization marked a profound shift, moving away from seeking polished perfection towards appreciating the deeply resilient beauty found in what is incomplete, flawed, and constantly evolving. The city, viewed through these new eyes, became less of a rigid system and more of a breathing organism, a sprawling acceptance of its own contradictions. And perhaps that was the truest measure of wisdom, to find inherent nobility not by transcending reality's messiness, but by embracing it fully. The dust of the streets still coated everything. It clung to the sandals, settled in the folds of the tunic, and found its way into the deepest corners of thought. The lessons learned over these last weeks were not contained in scrolls or spoken by wise men. They were etched onto the skin through cold nights, derived from the silence of a single meal, and witnessed in the effortless dignity of those who owned nothing but their next breath. The grand philosophies of the academy, they had felt so solid, built on dialectic and rigorous argumentation. But theory, it turns out, is a lovely thing. It is soft and intellectual, designed for cushioned seats and heated rooms. When stripped down to the elemental truth, philosophy feels dangerously flimsy. It requires only thought, but life demands sacrifice. The great question that had started this journey, what was the actual purpose of all this accumulation, had found its brutal answer in simple existence. Status meant nothing when faced with a sudden chill. Knowledge failed to provide adequate shelter from rain. And wealth, it could not buy warmth nor teach contentment. I recall the faces of those who once considered me an eccentric fool, whose simplicity they mistook for poverty of mind. I see them now through the haze of memory. They looked at my coarse clothing and saw a failure of taste. They heard my lack of ambition and interpreted it as uselessness. Their judgments were built entirely upon invisible walls made of expectation, convenience, and curated appearances. The hardest part of shedding those comfortable assumptions was accepting that the people who sought to enlighten me often lacked wisdom themselves. They possessed definitions, a proper way to conduct oneself, a suitable expenditure, an appropriate level of concern for one's reputation. These definitions were shackles, disguised as social grace. I wandered back toward the edges of the city today, drawn not by necessity but by a profound restlessness. I stood at the boundary where the carefully manicured marble paths ended and the earth began to rise up again, uneven, dusty, vibrant with untamed life. Here, there was no expectation of splendor. The ground simply was. And so I sat, not out of resignation, but out of a deliberate need for reckoning. The self I had been cultivating in these weeks felt exposed. It was an open wound, pulsing with raw awareness. Was this stripping away truly freedom, or was it merely exile? The internal noise was deafening at first. The phantom whisper of what I should be doing, who I should impress, what life should look like for someone possessing intellect and spirit. The old narratives, polished and demanding, screamed their presence. They demanded a return to predictable patterns. But then, as dawn painted the eastern sky in soft grays and bruised purples, a strange calm descended. This was not the peace of comfort. It felt like the solid stillness found only after an immense storm has passed through the landscape of the mind. The conversation I needed to have was silent. It was with the self that had been both my guide and my cage. The self preoccupied with appearance, with proving its worth through clever remarks and well-chosen garments. The self desperate for external affirmation like applause or approval. I addressed it with an honesty bordering on contempt. You are exhausting. Your need to be seen is a far heavier burden than any physical toil I have endured. It requires constant maintenance, endless performance, and the perpetual fear of invisibility. If you cease performing, you collapse into a void of meaninglessness. And slowly, subtly, that self began to fade. The frantic energy lessened. There was an emerging understanding. The core struggle is not with society's expectations, but with my own internalized commitment to those very same ideals. I had been criticizing Rome while operating by its deepest tenets. The path forward does not require a grand manifesto or a public return to revelry. It requires only alignment, the slow, deliberate straightening of one's internal compass until it points toward essential truth. This realization is quiet, profoundly inconvenient, and utterly liberating. It means that the greatest wisdom is often found in the radical act of negation. Understanding what life is not allows us finally to perceive what it truly is. The journey back into the flow of human activity will be marked not by bold pronouncements, but by a subtle internal modification. A quiet indifference to the opinions that once felt like vital sustenance. An appreciation for the messy reality over the polished illusion. To live simply means accepting the raw beauty of imperfection. It means realizing that strength is found in adaptability, not in rigid adherence to an ideal. This profound silence, this inner dialogue with the stripped bare self, has taught me that freedom is not a destination achieved by acquiring some perfect understanding. It is a muscle developed through continuous voluntary discomfort, strengthened by relinquishing every single comforting attachment, be they possessions, titles, or even expectation itself. I am finally learning to carry my truth lightly, like dust on the wind, accepting its flow without needing to capture it in permanence. Having wandered through the discomfort of the world, stripped bare by cold nights and simple meals, the pursuit of truth finally settled upon a radical premise. It was not found in scrolls or lectures, nor in the accumulation of goods. It resided instead in the profound emptiness beneath every desire we held dear. The weight of status, once seeming so necessary for dignity, now felt like an elaborate cloak woven only from fragile expectation. We spent our lives performing roles: the wealthy scholar, the powerful merchant, the dutiful citizen, all striving to validate a self that was not truly present. This charade was exhausting, a constant performance designed to mask a fundamental inner poverty. The cynicism we had initially adopted was not simply an intellectual exercise. It was a necessary shedding of false skin. The question now loomed larger than any debate in the forum: what is worth having? After embracing the meager simplicity of existence, the bread and water, the sleep upon rough earth, we learned that having often equaled lacking, because it required perpetual defense against loss. The things we chased were mere anchors, tying us to a life of relentless worry, comparison, and fear. This understanding forced a complete reevaluation of our primary concepts: wealth, power, success. We had been taught that these external metrics defined human value, that true prosperity lay in the overflowing coffers or the grand size of one's estate. But confronting radical need, the gnawing hunger, the chill of genuine night, taught us a brutal arithmetic. The rich were not necessarily happier, they were merely more complicatedly burdened. The true measure of life was revealed to be internal resourcefulness. It was the quiet resilience that allowed us to wake up when every fiber of modern comfort screamed for sleep. It was the ability to find satisfaction in effort itself, rather than in the consumption of reward. This realization redefined prosperity from an outward state to a deep, quiet inner disposition. Wealth, we realized, is not what fills our stomachs. It is how little we require that others provide. The accumulation of possessions demands management, protection, display, and maintenance. Each object becomes a master, subtly dictating our behavior and limiting the scope of our spontaneous existence. By rejecting these objects, we did not lose anything. Rather, we shed countless invisible chains. The liberation was paradoxical. To become free from desire felt like gaining immense physical bulk, a weight that seemed to slow us down, but which paradoxically allowed us to walk with a lightness never before experienced. We were freed from the tyranny of more. The yearning for the next promotion, the grander villa, the more luxurious leisure, dissolved into an indifference that was nothing short of profound power. The greatest challenge remaining was not physical hardship, but emotional detachment within society. How do you walk back among those who measure worth by outward trappings without adopting their delusions? It required a steady, unshakable composure, a kind of philosophical invisibility. We learned to observe the rich and powerful with the clarity of detached scientists. Their struggles were magnificent tapestries woven from insecurity, status anxiety, and deeply ingrained fear. They clung fiercely to the illusion because acknowledging the vacuum left by true simplicity was too terrifying. The new definition demanded radical emotional self-sufficiency. It meant that if our deepest source of happiness, our peace, our sense of worth, came solely from within us, then nothing external could ever truly diminish it or take it away. This immunity to societal whim was the highest form of wealth imaginable. To possess that inner fortress, impervious to market crashes, royal displeasure, or even mockery, was true self-mastery. We had journeyed far beyond merely rejecting luxury. We were now redefining the foundation upon which a meaningful life must rest. True wealth is therefore defined by capacity, the ability to respond wisely to whatever reality presents itself, and freedom from desire. It is not a collection of things, but a state of constant being. To be rich in this sense meant owning oneself entirely, unencumbered by debt, title, or expectation. The lesson was transformative. The greatest luxury of all is indifference to what we lack. When we accept that our fundamental needs are met through wisdom and virtue, the inner resources, all other forms of wealth become irrelevant decorations on a life already deeply complete. It is the quiet hum of self-possession in a world determined to make us feel perpetually inadequate. The journey back felt less like a return and more like an undoing. After embracing the stark simplicity of nights spent beneath open stars, after tasting meals composed only of Earth's basic gifts, I understood that my true home was not within these city walls, nor in any comfortable cot cushioned by privilege. It was housed deep inside the stillness of my own making. The expectations waiting for me were a palpable thing, heavy and scented with stale incense and preserved routine. They expected the old self to reappear, the man who argued at banquets, the scholar burdened by his reputation, the seeker who believed that truth could only be found in an academic treatise or a dramatic exile's tale. I walked through the familiar avenues, yet everything appeared alien. The silks still draped opulence onto shoulders of privilege. The expensive togas still whispered promises of belonging and status. But now I saw them for what they truly were: elaborate costumes worn over fundamental uncertainty. The contrast was brutal. My sandals, scuffed and simple, met the polished marble that had long symbolized unshakable authority. The whispers followed me, questions about my disappearance, inquiries into my sudden, radical lack of possessions. Their concern sounded less like genuine worry and more like irritation at a disrupted social pattern. They saw only the empty stomach, the rough tunic, the eyes that held too much sky for these ornate rooms. They could not comprehend that I had traded superficial comforts for fundamental clarity. I had exchanged the gilded cage for a vast, terrifying, but infinitely open air. My internal struggle was subtle yet profound. The old habits of self-protection, the desire to explain myself, to defend my philosophy with eloquent speeches, felt hollow and utterly meaningless. My deepest realization, forged in hardship and silence, was that language itself could be a weight, an unnecessary decoration on the raw bone of being. The world had not changed. Rather, I had fundamentally shifted the axis upon which I viewed it. The great struggle was no longer convincing others of my truth. The fight had moved inward, reaching a quiet, unshakable center where external opinion simply ceased to hold power. I learned that true knowledge required an emotional detachment from outcome. When you stop caring whether your unconventional life will be understood or praised, you become immune to the very weaponry society uses to enforce conformity: ridicule, exclusion, and expectation. The great irony was this: by shedding everything I believed defined me, my status, my intellectual pursuits, even my belief in a linear narrative of progress, I had paradoxically achieved the most potent form of self-definition. My worth remained untouched by their judgment, impervious to their praise. Returning to society meant mastering a deep philosophical indifference. It was not apathy. It was recognizing that while these people and rituals were part of the human tapestry, they constituted only one thread among many countless ones. They could enrich life through connection, but they could never define its value or dictate its terms. The way I moved changed dramatically. Where before there had been an anxious striving to prove my insights, to make the grand philosophical gesture at the next dinner party, now there was a deliberate ease. My feet seemed lighter because I was no longer carrying the burden of expectation. The burdens were always imaginary: the weight of a perfect reputation, the fear of being deemed too poor or too rough, the need to belong. I walked through their complex rituals with an observer's calm detachment. When they spoke of inherited wealth and future accolades, I heard only echoes of desire, the tireless, consuming noise of wanting more. The true lesson was realizing that dependency is the deepest form of slavery, far worse than any physical chain. When questioned about my time away, I offered responses stripped bare of defense or explanation. If asked why I left, I would simply point to the sky and say that nothing in the city's structured life could contain the vastness I needed to breathe. It was not an indictment, merely a statement of necessary alignment. The people were accustomed to stories with dramatic arcs: the noble exile who returns triumphant, or the man forced back into comfort by tragedy. They were ill-equipped for simply returning as oneself, unadorned, unburdened, existing merely at the rhythm of breath and sun. I understood then that my task was not to reform them, which was an impossible, futile effort requiring me to adopt their exhausting standards of hope. My task was only to keep practicing this self-possession, to live out the quiet knowledge that freedom is not a destination, but a daily act of subtraction, subtracting desire, subtracting attachment, subtracting the need for external confirmation. My presence became an accidental philosophy lecture. The greatest disruption I offered was not a speech or a shocking question. It was simply my sustained embodiment of peace derived from radical self-reliance. A man who knows he needs nothing cannot be easily judged, mocked, or swayed. He simply is. I remained in the periphery, engaging only when necessary, and always with an unhurried calmness that defied the hurried desperation of their interactions. This was not a rejection of humanity itself. It was a radical acceptance of human nature's inherent flaws: the grasping hand, the flattering lie, the fear masked by custom. The final, quiet understanding settled over me. I had returned to the world not to conquer its vices or educate its populace, but merely to inhabit it with honesty, to move through its beauty and its ugliness, its richness and its poverty, carrying only the light feather of my own internalized truth. My feet were lighter because they no longer carried the invisible weights of should, must, or expected. I was home, finally unburdened by anything but breath. The journey was not about finding a place of comfort, nor was it about acquiring some grand, definitive truth. It was, ultimately, a quiet process of subtraction, a slow peeling back of the layers we had mistakenly believed were essential to being human. We spent so much time constructing lives on sand, elaborate edifices of status and possessions that seemed solid enough to withstand any storm. But beneath the gilded surface, those foundations were always shifting, built entirely upon anticipation and desire. The city's clamor, once overwhelming, had begun to sound thin, artificial. It was a noise generated by endless wants. We realized then that true stability does not come from what we gather, but from what we are willing to discard. We learned to breathe again in the simple space between breaths, to observe the rhythm of things untainted by human ambition. There is an incredible quietude that exists simply outside the rush-hour traffic, away from the polished facades and the demands of social performance. This silence was not empty, it was full. It was full of unfiltered observation, the sound of life functioning without needing to impress anyone. The ultimate lesson of simplicity is that sufficiency is a state of mind, not a material condition. When we stop equating worth with complexity, the more things we own, the higher our title, the grander our surroundings, we unlock something profound. We unlock genuine quiet power. The final realization was perhaps the most gentle, yet the most difficult. That self-mastery is simply the act of ceasing to care about what others think. It means allowing oneself to exist unadorned in a world obsessed with display. To walk through life carrying only the weight of one's own thoughts and actions, stripped clean of inherited expectations. This radical simplicity demands a constant vigilance against the creeping tendrils of comfort. The moment we become too comfortable, whether it is the plush pillow, the familiar routine, or the approval of an old acquaintance, is the moment we begin to slip back into the velvet cage. The true depth of understanding arrived when I understood that rejection was not merely physical. It had to be emotional. It required letting go of resentment towards a life that seemed easy for others, and accepting my own present circumstances without complaint or longing. This indifference is not apathy. It is active engagement with reality in its purest form. It is seeing the flawed seam in the wall, recognizing its function, rather than recoiling from its imperfections. To be free means being comfortable in imperfection. The great wisdom, gleaned over these weeks of discomfort and humble living, pointed to one undeniable truth. Our humanity is not measured by our ability to manage luxury. It is measured by our resilience when luxury is entirely removed. We found that the true scope of a life was contained within the parameters of basic needs: a clean meal, shelter for the night, and the capacity to think clearly in the face of uncertainty. These fundamentals are not limitations, they are anchors. They anchor us to what truly matters, the integrity of our character. Our purpose is therefore internal. It must be built upon principles that do not decay when the economy crashes or when the social whispers turn venomous. The structure of a meaningful life cannot depend on titles, currencies, or even predictable kindness. The power of simplicity lies in its resistance to complexity. Where civilization builds intricate traps of obligation and expectation, simplicity offers clear sightlines. It allows us to see beyond the glittering facade and glimpse the simple, enduring mechanism of human existence: the breath, the need for community, the pursuit of honest understanding. We returned to the edges of the city, drawn by the elemental rhythm of things that did not require an audience or a receipt. There, among the worn paths and the unsanctioned beauty, we finally began to truly see. Not just what was lacking in our old lives, but what had always been abundant: the sheer gift